I'm making a video game with underwater mechanics. In this devlog, remaking the player movement, blended animations, dynamic colliders, level resizing. The character controller's move mechanics were completely redone. The first thing I removed was the jump animation. It is a bit awkward looking and did not serve a purpose. Then, I abstracted out the condition checks since they were done in the update method. I drew a diagram of how the player state machine should work. With that in place, I started rewriting the update method. First, I double-checked that the encumbered state was working properly and the UI reflected the state correctly. With that out of the way, I focused on redoing the movement portions. The first step was to store internal state when buttons were pressed. The original version of the method was doing physics manipulations in the update method, which led to some jittery jumps when frame rate changed. After that, I added horizontal movement without worrying about animations, just to slowly get things working. Then, I added a fixed vertical movement and I worked on correcting the sprite rotation. Sprite rotation is now a separate method called by the update method. Since the animation graph is a state machine, I decided to implement an internal state machine by using an enum. The update method calculates the state by using the input and current conditions. I then mirrored the state to the animation, setting appropriate flags for conditions. I updated the UI to display the current state so I could more easily visually debug the states in case things seemed off. I also found a couple of bugs with the transitions that were missing. Previously, the player would become idle after being hit while they kept walking. The second bug was a missing transition between sinking and grounded, which left the player sinking over an object they were standing on. With all the info up front, I worked on re-implementing the velocity changes. The old move system set a maximum velocity based on state, but it changed velocities in different places. For the new system, I wanted a single method that would set all the maximums based on state. The logic for these is fairly simple. The overdrive mechanic increases velocity by a factor of 2.25. Being encumbered reduces velocity by half. When sinking, the encumbered condition should also increase the velocity. With these velocities in place, I worked on setting a blend tree that would blend animations based on the current velocity. I started with the walk and run cycle. I set up a secondary motion that just placed the walk animation at 2x speed, so when you're in overdrive mode, the animation matches the velocity. While setting this up, I ran into a couple of problems. The first problem was during the regular walk animation, where the rate of movement becomes 0.4 instead of 0.5, which is the threshold needed to play the animation at 1x speed. The blend parameter is based on the following thresholds when the velocity values go from 0 to 2.25. I have to use a piecewise function in order to coerce values to be between 0 and 0.5 when the movement is below the overdrive threshold, and 0.5 to 1.0 when in overdrive mode. Once I implemented this, I ran into another bug since I was subtracting 0.5 from the second part of the formula. Note here the rate moving left goes down to 0.25 instead of 0.75 when in overdrive mode. So I updated the formula to instead add 0.5 and compute a percentage of the remainder 0.5 based on max velocity possible. After fixing this, I used the same formula for the sink and swim animations. I created a blend tree for each motion, with the same ranges for 1x and 2x speed, setting the animation parameters based on the type of movement. With motion out of the way, I connected the oxygen consumption system and set the appropriate conditions so oxygen could deplete at the correct interval. My initial idea for vertical movement was to use animation events during the character strokes and apply forces. To prepare for that, I set up the animation events and just used a debug statement to print to the console and watch the rate of events being fired. While working on this, I found that I needed a lot of force using the Force 2D impulse mode, which made the animations too jittery since the velocity is clamped to a maximum value. I then tried just applying a force continuously within the fixed update method, and that felt much smoother. I tinkered with the value for a while since I wanted to avoid long recovery times when switching from sink to swim. Eventually, I found a good value. For comparison, here's a movement sample with the old and new vertical values. With vertical forces working, I decided to test using forces on the horizontal axis. The first issue I had with this was that the controls no longer felt responsive. When you stop pressing the left and right keys, the character still moves. This felt extra clunky when trying a vertical drop section in which you dodge obstacles from side to side. I decided against using a force. Since the horizontal velocity uses the input value and multiplies it times the maximum, this creates a minor acceleration period, which is the movement feeling I wanted originally. Once I was happy with the movement for both axes, I cleaned up the code a little bit. Here's a comparison between the size of the old update method and the new one. With the movement states tracking correctly, I proceeded to tackle the problem with the collider's bounds. When swimming and sinking, the bounding box is sometimes outside of a character sprite, which leads to ghost collisions. I solved this by adjusting the collider for each initial animation sprite and storing the offset and size values in the player controller. Then, based on the player's state, I changed the collider sizes to reflect the appropriate offset and size. While playtesting, I found that the collider was still a bit too wide when moving near the stalagmites. I started by shrinking the width of the idle and walk state. With the new metrics, I updated the sink and swim colliders to use the helmet as a reference for how wide the bounding box should be. Then, I tested the transition between all three states to ensure not moving horizontally would still avoid a stalactite. With those two items out of the way, I created a demo build and had one of my game dev friends play it and received some valuable feedback. He gave me a couple of suggestions to try for the movement. 1. Slow the fast movement down a bit. 2. Make the encumbered penalty less, about 2/3. Here's what the current move limits are based on what condition the player is in. He also gave me some feedback regarding the level sizing and ideas to try out. With this new idea set, I decided to try a different approach to the level sizes. With the goal of having smaller levels, I created a timer and added it to the first level, just to determine how much distance I could cover. My initial metric was to have about 20 seconds to get to the objective, and then 30 to 40 seconds to carry the chest back, based on the weight restriction. I printed out the first level and circled the portions that I enjoyed the most, in order to use those as inspiration for the next level set. My goal with the first three initial levels was to focus on a particular move mechanic, and teach the player about momentum control in that direction. With a rough idea of the shapes of levels, I created a new scene and measured out a box where traversal would take about 30 seconds to move from one end to the other. This gave me a max size when fitting the level ideas during the blockout phase. My goal with these three levels was that they could be completed within 16 seconds. This led to changing the oxygen consumption strategy to be time-based instead of motion-based. Also, going fast no longer consumes oxygen faster. Another mechanical suggestion I'm trying is giving the player a few chances before they fail the level. Since the timing for each level is about 60 seconds, I increased the damage the stalactites and mines do to 10. This should allow a player to hit traps 3 times and still complete a level, provided they are moving fast. Since the player is now invincible, having one meaningful hit is punishing but not unfair, like the continuous damage model would be if damage was this high. With the addition of more levels, I plan to make a Mario World style setup with a level theme and multiple levels. Each world will have about 6 levels, with different difficulties. For this first world, the plan is to have 3 easy levels where you collect a single chest, 2 medium levels where you gather 2 chests, 1 hard level where you gather 3 chests. At the moment, you only need to gather 1 chest to exit a level. I may or may not change this when I revisit the scoring mechanic. The first level has a couple of goals. 1. Teach the player how the character behaves when moving in an arc. And 2. Teach the player how to control the arc between a floor and ceiling trap. The first level is also smaller, 50 by 30 units. The original first level was 180 by 140. With the design in mind, I blocked out the first level. The yellow boxes are ground, and red boxes do 10 damage. Once I had something blocked out, I play tested the flow of it by trying the level without using boost as much. Then, I tried a quick speed run using boost as much as possible without hitting the damage blocks. Here's a high-level view of the shape of the first level. Using the same scene, I set an area to block out the second level. This level's philosophy is teaching the player about vertical movement. 1. How to move horizontally when swimming or sinking. 2. How to control their descent. Prior to adding damage blocks, I tried out the distance in the empty level to ensure it wasn't too big. Then, I added damage blocks and tried moving through the level. Once again, I tried completing the level without being hit and using boost where it was convenient. Here's a high-level view of the shape. Being happy with this block out, I moved on to a third level. In the same scene, I also set up the third level's area. This level's philosophy is teaching the player about diagonal movement. 1. How to control the swim and sink movement diagonally to avoid obstacles. Originally, this level was going to be the first level with 2 chests and 2 sections, so I started by blocking out the left section. I wanted the level to be less linear and offer the option to connect both sides with a tunnel. Once again, I measured distances before adding the damage blocks. When I added the chest, the traversal time became about 40 seconds when gathering both chests. This felt a bit off, but I decided to add the damage blocks and play with the prototype. During this attempt, I reached the entrance with 2 oxygen left, which felt much harder. Since my objective was to introduce the diagonal mechanic, this level was both doing that and making it much challenging by having 2 chests. I decided to drop this being the third level and went back to the drawing board. I made a new sketch for the third level. I wanted this to be more linear and easier to learn, still keeping the diagonal objectives. I once again started by blocking things out in the same scene. Then, I checked the distance without damage blocks, with and without a chest. I added damage blocks and tried out the level again. And like the other levels, I did a speed run without being hit just to ensure it was at a good spot. Happy with the results, it was time to move to making the levels pretty. Here's the high-level design for the third level. The art path for each level began by copying the original scene and duplicating it, naming it appropriately. Then, deleting the blockouts for the levels that didn't fit the scene. The process for all 3 levels followed the same approach. First, I created a tile map on top of the ground blockout and set that to be the new ground. Then, I played the level with the current tile map. Since the blockout sometimes doesn't align to the grid, I have to move tiles a bit to ensure there's plenty of room between traps. With the walls in place, I work on replacing the damage blocks with mines and stalactites. The single block setup can either be a mine or stalactite, and the multi-block setup usually becomes a stalactite. With the traps in place, I then create another tile map that has no collider, and it becomes the filler between collidable walls. I use the player's camera outline to ensure I have enough filler on the sides of the level. I move the player onto the edges at each angle and cover the parts still visible by the camera. Lastly, I play test the level to ensure the traps have enough space. If I find that I need more wiggle room and adjusting the traps to the side doesn't work, I'll rework some of the collidable walls. Here's what each of these levels look like, comparing them between their blockout version and their art path. The last thing I worked on was including the levels on the level selection screen and wiring the buttons to load those scenes. While laying out the traps for a level, I noticed a problem with the solo tall stalactite. The current end pieces don't align properly. That's it for this devlog. My focus for the next part will be fix the problem with the 2 tile tall stalagmites, work on creating the medium levels. Until next time.